Hi guys, welcome to our first video for AP Environmental Science. Sorry a little bit for the echo here. We're recording this in the classroom, and so just testing out and see what the acoustics sound like. We are going to start with our first video for environmental science. AP Environmental Science, also often referred to as APES. That just obviously comes from the initials of everything, Advanced Placement Environmental Science, and so that's how it's going to get referred to most of the time. So hopefully no one will take offense when we refer to the class as APES. In this video, we're just going to cover over some of the basics of what we're going to be doing this year in really broad general strokes, and then we'll get down to the specifics in the next few videos here. So environmental studies as a whole encompasses a lot of different areas, and we're going to cover a bunch of these different things. And so the first types of things that it covers are sciences. It's going to cover obviously a lot of biology and ecology. I think ecology is probably what people think of the most when they think of environmental science, and certainly the biology plays a large role in that. It's going to cover a lot of chemistry, because there's a lot of measuring of pollutants and of things like that that are going to involve chemical means to do that. There's a lot of earth science activity because we're going to do a lot of soil testing and water testing and how weather affects some of these things and climate. And so these are all parts of earth sciences. Obviously atmospheric sciences sort of roll into that as well, and with the weather and with air quality and things that are really important to those of us in East Tennessee right now. So that's the science part of environmental science. But environmental science, or environmental studies at least, also encompasses a lot of social sciences or humanities types areas too. So we're going to talk a lot this year about economics. We're going to talk a lot about politics and ethics, okay? Because we can talk about what the science is, there's this much pollutant, but then we have to talk about what do the laws say about how much we can have, okay? Is it ethically responsible to have that much of the stuff there? Okay, so those are the types of things that we're going to talk about. Now what this means is that environmental science, this course is going to be way more multidisciplinary than most science classes that you've taken before. We're not just going to sit in our little box and say this is strictly what my class is about. This is chemistry, and all we're going to talk about is chemistry. We're going to branch out into other areas, not just in sciences, but in other areas as well, to be able to make some informed arguments and some informed conclusions about the things that we talk about scientifically. And a lot of what we're going to talk about this year is going to revolve around the idea of environmental indicators. And what environmental indicators do is they're going to describe the current state of an environmental system. So when we go out and we test the soil sample, or when we go out and place our ozone meters outside, what we're testing in general is the current state of the system. Okay, there are ways to test past states of systems, but they're much harder, and we'll talk about some of those later in the year. But most of what we're going to do is we're going to test current states, and specifically, what we want to talk about in environmental science as a whole is we want to talk about global environmental indicators. Now we're going to talk about them in most cases in a very specific instance. But what we'll do then is we're going to extrapolate and say, how does this specific instance, how does this apply on a broad scale as well? And so there are 5 environmental indicators that we're going to talk about this year, very broad categories. And these are not like chapters or units in your book, but these are sort of themes that should always be in the back of your head as we're going through everything else the rest of the year. So the first of these is biological diversity, and this would be sort of what it sounds like. Diversity means how many different kinds of something there are. Okay, and so the first way that we generally think about this is species diversity. We think about how many different organisms are there, how many different types of plants are there, how many different kinds of animals are there. All of those things are in a specific area. Okay, that's valuable. We can make, and we will later this year, make all kinds of aesthetic and ethical arguments for why we should have so many different kinds of species, why we should try to protect this one, what seems like really we're worried about this one little species of fish when there's a lot of other species of fish. But there's a lot to be said for the biological diversity of species, and we're going to talk about that specifically. Where this also plays into is genetic diversity of species. If you've had biology class, you remember that generally a lot of things are going to be more, a lot of organisms are going to be more stable the more availability they have to some genetic diversity. It allows them to be a lot more adaptable in the case of some sort of trauma. So if there's not much genetic diversity, then something like a disease can come in and very easily wipe a lot of things out. And the other thing that we'll talk about certainly a lot this year is what we call ecosystem diversity or ecosystem diversity. And this is, we've got all kinds of different ecosystems, and we can say biomes in a broader sense and stuff like that. And these things all have uses, even though sometimes we didn't think they did. So a good example for me is I grew up in Florida, and when Florida was first started to become developed, and certainly in the 20th century, large patches of Florida are basically swamp or wetlands. And so that didn't seem very useful to the people at the time. So they drained them and then built stuff over them. Okay, but what they found out is that killed off a lot of the species, and it caused all kinds of other problems. They started to have flooding issues. They started to not be able to grow the same types of crops that they grew before because there wasn't enough diversity in the ecosystem anymore. Okay, and so that's the type of biological diversity stuff that we're going to be talking about. The next area is that of food production. We're going to talk a lot about this year about food production because ultimately, when we make a lot of these environmental decisions, we can talk about the ethics and all of these things that are related to it, but what actually matters a whole lot is, can we produce the food that we need to feed the people on the planet? Okay, are we using the land in a way to get the food production that we need out? That doesn't necessarily have to mean maximum food production at all times, but certainly as population increases, then that becomes more important. Our third global indicator is, and you could sort of broadly categorize this as environmental changes or climate changes. But what we're going to look at is average global temperature and average CO2 concentrations. We know that these are sort of big hot button issues, and this is where stuff like politics and ethics really starts to come into play that we're going to talk about. But we're going to talk about what are the trends in these things, okay? Has the temperature been going up overall? CO2 concentrations have been rising. And is this strictly due to human behavior? Is it due to our cars? Is it due to the agricultural things that we're growing as well? And so we're going to discuss a lot of these things throughout the year. And remember, these aren't like units. We're not just going to talk in one unit about CO2 concentrations. These are overarching themes that are going to pop up throughout the entire year. We talked a couple of slides ago about food production. Obviously tied right into food production is something like human population. So I took this little snapshot when I was putting this slideshow together just yesterday. So this is the current human population as of yesterday, about 7,059 million. And if we say clicked on this link here, we go to the page and we can actually see what it's like today. Okay, and so we see it's still there, but going up. We've already added like 100,000 people since 9 o'clock last night when I pulled that up. So we're going to talk a lot about human population and where the human population is and how that has effects on environmental things. And then our last one, and this is one that sort of is a hot button and gets talked about all the time, but is resource depletion. We have a certain number of resources on the planet, and some of them are renewable. Okay, we can make more of them. Some of them are non-renewable, that we can't make more in any sort of way quick enough to actually replenish them. And some of them are really super long-term, okay, basically inexhaustible as far as we're concerned. So something like solar power is essentially inexhaustible. But oil, like in the case of an oil well here, this is a non-renewable resource that we're going to run out of. Nuclear power, uranium, is essentially a non-renewable resource. Now, we have a lot of it, but once we use it up, we're not going to make more of it. Okay, and then even when we have renewable resources, something like, say, timber or crops or something like that, they're renewable as long as we don't consume them faster than we are renewing them. So if we're cutting down more forest than than the rate of the forest growing, then we're having a problem. If we're overfishing an area, meaning that we're fishing more than the fish can repopulate themselves, then that all of a sudden becomes a non-renewable resource. So that's the fifth theme that we're going to talk about throughout this year. Essentially, those are the 5 indicators, okay? So your overall theme that you really want to focus on at everything we do this year in environmental science is sustainability, okay? What is sustainability? Sustainability is that we find a way to live on Earth that lets us use the resources that are here for us, but that doesn't deplete them so that future generations don't have any of those resources, okay? Some of these resources are valuable in lots of ways. Like when we get into oil, we'll talk about later that it's not just for power usage or for powering our cars that oil is necessary for, but we need it to make plastics. And so if we use up all the oil now, we have to find alternative ways to make plastics that maybe aren't as good or maybe aren't as cheap as using oil to do it. Okay? And so we want to focus on things that are going to be sustainable. That is the key theme of everything that we talk about in AP Environmental Science. Is we're going to focus on sustainability. Can we sustainably keep doing these things at these paces in this area and globally